This is Season 3, Episode 5 of Mastering the RPG, a tabletop RPG podcast all about upping your game. Doesn't matter if you're a game master or player, you'll find advice, ideas, and some strong opinions. Our episode tonight is Flavoring Magic and Special Items, or Magic Missile Can Be More. Hey everyone, welcome again to Mastering the RPG. Like I said, a tabletop RPG podcast where you'll get advice, ideas, cool stuff found, all sorts of good stuff. I'm Carl with my co-hosts Eric and James. You can find information about the show at masteringtherpg.com. You can send us email, feedback, ask us questions at gamemaster@masteringtherpg.com. And it's good to be back on the mics with everybody. Feels like it's like 2 weeks between times when we talk. It's amazingly enough. So, so how's everybody been? What's been going on? I mean, we're recording today on Halloween. Didn't do a Halloween game this year.
Special?
Yeah, didn't do that. Okay. No, we didn't do that. Nor did I join in with any of the online conventions that allowed for kind of the Halloween themed stuff. So I didn't do that this year. I feel bad about it, but just too much in my world going on to do that. But we did give out like $300 worth of candy. So we did do that, but we didn't get a chance to run a game. So what about you guys? Eric, what have you been up to?
Just playing games. Been taking a lot of notes now for my Savage World Cyberpunk conversion 2077. Did a lot of quote-unquote research by playing the video game and watching the anime. So just dealing with the net running, which is the big kind of that's the big hurdle, right? I mean, we've talked a lot about hacking and net running in Cyberpunk worlds and things that we like to change, me and Carl. So that's been the big hurdle, but I pretty much have it narrowed down at this point. So just going to start writing soon. Good,
cool, very cool.
Very nice. I'm in mini boss hell at the moment. I don't know what's going on with my games. Our games are coming to the end, my annual kind of campaign, so that's a bit fun. So we have this strange thing in Australia next week where everyone gets a day off so that we can watch a horse race. So I'm spending that time kind of prepping. But this week has just been all about mini bosses. That kind of last adversary, the last lieutenant, with about a month to go left in a campaign. So it's been a bit interesting. I've got kind of groups all over the place having big, large, multifaceted boss fights, which has had its own little level of experience. Killed a kid yesterday on Halloween, which was kind of a bit fun. That's right, they resurrected him. Everything was okay. Had to talk another kid off the cliff. I had a barbarian 14-year-old that just refused to back down when the rest of the group had fled. Which is kind of fun, playing Call of the Netherdeep on that one, and they're fighting this massive tentacled undersea creature, and Vanarak the Barbarian said, "You'll never take me alive," and the rest of the group went, "We can't kill this thing, we're all running away," and they just slowly ran away from this 14-year-old kid, and I, for the first time I had to sit down and say, "Hey dude, we might have to roll up a new character for you," which is a bit interesting. He was not having a bar of it. He was going to go out in a heroic the last stand. In the end, he chose not to. Have you ever had one of those where you just go, hang on a minute, this one person's not going to make it?
Oh, yeah, lots of times where there always is the one person who wants to make the heroic stand and be the one to stop the tide of evil while everyone else escapes, and they give themselves for the common good or the greater good, and, roll up a new character. So,
yeah. Sometimes it's, I've seen it happen a lot. Sometimes it's that person, like, genuinely just wants to play new characters. So they're like, okay, here's a good narrative time for me to do that. You talk with your GM. Other times it is true. Like sometimes there are times where your character, you're like, if I'm really role-playing and being honest, they would not leave at this point, or they would stay behind to like give the other people a chance to escape, or for whatever it is, or their vengeance is too strong, their desire for vengeance or their desire for hatred for this type of monster. So I've seen it a lot, and sometimes it does better than other times, but I do think that when it does happen, that it should be, I feel like the other people in the party should get like inspired in some way, or there should be like there was some settings have mechanics for that. I think it was, is it Rifts in Savage World Rifts? There's like a mechanic where you could just go out in a blaze of glory and like when you're dying, you can just choose to like go out and just basically kill your character, but you do this massive damage to the monster or something. So those are always fun moments when stuff like that.
You give your friends +1 on something, is that right?
Yeah, something like that. Or exactly.
Yeah, I think there's a setting in Savage Worlds where you get a set of bennies that you have to spend like at the last your last stand, and at the end, you are successful, but you're dead. At the end, no ifs, ands, or buts about it, but you're successful in whatever you were trying to accomplish, even if it was super difficult. So yeah, there's definitely probably a lot of games that have that kind of mechanic around that. So
me and the fellow kids managed to talk Vanarak down off the cliff, so he swam for his life, which was very kind of nice. So I had to struggle with that. It's okay. But anyway, 5 more weeks left of school games, so that's all very exciting. We're building to the crescendos and doing all big boss battles and big, massive, save the world kind of epic proportion stuff for the end of the year, which is a bit of fun.
Very cool.
But no Halloween. I had a Halloween game last night with one of my kids' groups, but you're right. I haven't done a Halloween at a convention this year, which is, I don't know. It's a bit lazy of me, maybe.
And I have my favorite one.
I didn't even trick or treat this year, so.
All right. Okay. Well, cool. Excellent. So let's go ahead and we don't have any cool stuff today or email to talk about, so let's get right to the main topic.
Mastering the RPG with Carl, Eric, and James. Yeah.
So the main topic is all about flavoring magic or special items, or we struggled with the title, right?
Special abilities.
Yeah, and so I think it's important that I ask the question of the panel: what do you mean by flavoring, so that everybody knows where we're coming from? And this topic is the least amount I know of. When I throw in my 2 cents worth, it probably will only be worth 2 cents. But so, Eric, when we talk about flavoring, what do you think about? What does that mean to you?
I think the important thing here, and we probably should have used this word instead, is reflavoring, right? Because in Savage Worlds, it's often flavoring or trappings, but in most other games, it's about reflavoring. So I think that's what we're really kind of talking about this time is reflavoring, and that is, because in so many games, a lot of spells, a lot of special abilities, a lot of things have a preset flavor to them, right? And they're usually kind of not generic, but these preset archetypes of flavor that we understand, right? So when we're talking about reflavoring, it's when you come up with a unique concept for your character and kind of actualizing that by changing the name and, the descriptive way powers, spells, abilities work. And I think that, like we've talked about, in Savage Worlds, this is a very easy thing to do because it is specifically, this is for Magic, it's specifically set up to be kind of customized.
By design, it's about flavoring. By design.
Yeah. But then in stuff like, even in Savage Worlds, like we take, something like Savage Pathfinder, which has these, it's being based on Pathfinder. So the class archetypes, like the way the classes, the way the kind of flavor of the magic of the classes, not necessarily that the specific powers, but, a bard gets their magic from some type of art, usually singing, right? The wizard gets their magic from studying and from tomes, and it's kind of dealing with the base kind of forms of magic. So even with that, in that, you have a lot of wiggle room to play with that. And then when we talk about like the big games like D&D and Pathfinder, those, not just magic, but also all the special abilities, they are already written in. There's already so much flavor written in. And I think it's really easy just to like, okay, well, that's what this spell's supposed to kind of feel like, so I'm just going to go with it. And you can be really like upset. Like this is a thing in D&D, I think, James, that you can speak of. Is like, there's a million fire magic, right? Fire magic, fireball, firebolt. It's all the good offensive spells are fire. And people often want to be like, well, I want to be a lightning mage. I want to be an ice mage. I want to be an acid mage. But I can't because there's no good spells that do that damage, right? And I think that, I think we're going to talk about a lot of things where game masters can do, but even like if you're just a player and your game master's not open to all that stuff, you can still stretch what the description, the flavor of spells. Maybe not something like Fireball because it just does damage, but other spells can still be kind of stretched to fit your theme. So I know that was a long-winded response, but yeah, that's generally, when we're talking about reflavoring, this is what we're all talking about. Yeah.
Okay.
I totally agree. Yeah. It's really about creating that feel or that look or that sense of a common theme by readjusting spells, and whether that's damage type or the way it might look or the way it might kind of appear within the world. Kind of creating things that do it. And I imagine, Carl, you probably do it far more than you probably realise. I imagine, particularly as a GM, creating worlds. We do a lot of this, where we change monsters to fit a theme. We change spells to fit a theme. We kind of start to tweak things a little bit to kind of move it around to double down on the flavour or a feel of a cult or a group or things like that. So reflavouring lots of stuff.
Yep, very good. Yeah, I'm a Savage Worlds primary, so it's sort of built into the DNA of the game. So I really don't think about it other than you just have to do it because.
That is true. I mean, there's sliding scales of games, aren't there? Dungeons and Dragons is very descriptive. A certain spell could be described as, intertwining green beams of energy, and players can guess what that is because it's consistent within that game, but you can reflavor things. Other games, I played Die. I had my first experience playing Die the other day, where you just flavor everything. They say you roll one dice, you add one attribute, but you come up with everything about it, what it looks like and how it works. So to be ultra descriptive. So somewhere in that sliding scale, you have to, work that muscle a little bit. You have to kind of come up with that creative output.
So that's why I think, generally in this discussion, I think the reflavoring is the thing to kind of focus on the most, right? Because that's where I think people struggle with the most, definitely.
So why? So that's what we mean by it, right? So, but why do it? Why bother, right? I mean, the D&D, there's books, and you can buy tons of books that have spells and flavor, and you've got something that throws acid, and that's what it does. It's an acid bolt, and okay, so that's what the spell says, and so why do we do it? Why do it? I think there's a variety of reasons. I mean, the first, and you brought it up, most interesting is just character differentiation. Make the character you're building uniquely your own. With the way you manifest your abilities is unique and different, and gives you all those role play opportunities based on what I think you mentioned it, right? There's a lot of fire magic, not a lot of ice magic, but so how do I make a character that's kind of interesting and differentiated based on that? So that's the first one that comes to my mind right away. James, what do you think? What are some of the other reasons you might want to do it?
Yeah, differentiating yourself is huge. And it leads to how you role play the character. Let's face it, when you're visualizing or imagining a character, it comes with all these trappings and abilities, and this is kind of what I'd like my character to be doing. And this is especially true for beginner players who, aren't constrained yet by what the mechanics of a game can do. They just want to say, I want to be able to do this and this and this and this. And so it's about creating that differentiation. And that will also lead to how the characters role played, how you kind of build them together and how they would socially interact. A good example is, and there are games that have done this very differently. I'm an old fan of the White Wolf series, and Mage the Ascension was the one that really triggered this for me. Mage the Ascension, the characters are effectively belief systems. You believe in something strongly and something will change in the world. But all of the magic was all about personal flavour, so that, there weren't spells per se. There's lots of abilities, but you combine them together to create a character that has both a belief system and a kind of arsenal of magical abilities. And it changes the way that you role play as well, if you start to bind all these into a common theme, into a common kind of look to the character, a visual look to the character. I don't know if I'm making any sense at all. Does that make sense?
That makes a lot of sense. Eric, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think differentiating is huge, especially on the player side, right? Because we play so many of these games, and when you're in so many games or you run so many games, a wizard is a wizard is a wizard, right? And it's or whatever. I mean, and we're not always just talking about just like the element. I mean, just the base mechanics of the way a class functions, like that flavor can be changed. But I think, I mean, at the top, it's also just fun. I think it's really fun to do this. It's also very surprising for other people, and this is both player and game master side. I mean, I think, Carl, for you, there's so many times, and I think James too, right? Like when Bisbo, I'd be like, oh, this is the power. I say this, I like write the name of my power, and I have this flavor that's totally weird. And you're like, wait, what power is this? Like you're like, I have to write the actual name of the power otherwise, because you're like, what is this power actually? So I think you can kind of, especially for people who play so many games, it's just kind of a breath of fresh air of when you bring out a new ability and people are like, well, what is this? I don't know what this is. And then you're like, oh, it's that. But it's like it's just a fun thing to like discover that this power is what they've known it to be in the past, but it's just because it's a different take. It just kind of, like I said, it's a refreshing take. And we've talked about this before with monsters, right? Like reflavoring monsters is a really kind of cheap, quote unquote, cheap way for game masters to mix it up with players, because they're surprised. It's not just like, oh, it's a troll. I know what a troll does. Just even reflavoring the troll to be something else and changing one or two things, like the players are, it's just that brings that mystery back to the game. So I think it's just that kind of like you talked about it, James, where new players don't have all these expectations and all, they're not used to all the things, right? This can kind of bring romance back, to the bedroom, as it were, to the flavor bedroom. So yeah. And then I think another part here is that it really does help make characters seem more grounded, seem more interesting into the world. When you start to, both in the way that you choose your abilities and the way that you change the flavor of your abilities, it definitely grounds your character more into the world, right? And it seems like they're a more kind of genuine living part of the world, because they are tied into whatever the flavor of the game is, or kind of acting off the flavor of the game, right? When I played, like James, in your game, when I was a little Bisbo, I was an artificer that was a little kobold inventor, but like as my exposure to the Feywild was like going on, and like I think I had some encounters with some things, like my normal kind of almost steampunky items took a more macabre turn. Like I had I think it was it shrink grow? It was like a shrink grow power or whatever that's called, enlarge shrink. And it was this like, I flavored it as this kind of inverted bag of holding that like was possessed with a extraplanar entity. And it was like, I would pull on its beard. It was this like kind of wrinkly face in this old bag of holding bag that no longer worked. And as I opened its like pulled on its beard, it screamed. And that's what caused like reality to distort. And that was only because I was reacting to the world and my character getting exposed to these new ideas, right? And these kind of things. So I changed my flavor as we went on. So it's also a really good way to like show yourself and the world and the other party members that you are interacting more with the world and your character's growing.
Very cool.
Absolutely. And it was cool to kind of watch Bisbo change a little bit as well. In that game, we used a lot of shadow magic as that game developed as well. From a tome of shadow that had a number of different shadow spells. Most of those were reflavored. Most of those spells were kind of, here's another, but I've just changed the damage to necrotic and given it a bit of a different flavor. But binding other different spells to kind of make that shadow. And it was interesting to watch the players start to embrace some of that black and shadow magic, which then changed the whole feel of the players, not just the world, but the players themselves starting to reflect the universe they were in. It was really cool.
That sounds really interesting. And I know, Eric, in our campaigns, you do a lot of, because it's Savage Worlds, obviously it's expected, but you really embrace that approach to flavoring things in just unique ways. And so I guess the question then becomes, with that experience, it's easier to do as you get experience, but how do you approach it? And I think maybe it may sound intuitive, but I have games that, Eric, you're in, where folks are still just talking about, in Savage Worlds, there's basic powers like Bolt or Blast, and they're just generic area of effect, and you trap them as a fireball, or it could be a ball of lightning, or it could be whatever you want. and it could be a group of bees coming from your fingertips. That's even an example in the book. But a lot of the players still don't. They still just talk about, well, I'm going to use my blast power. They don't really flavor it. So I think, how do you approach it to really attack it? And I know I've got a couple of items on the outline, but let's just throw them out because I don't like them. Let's just talk and say, how do you do it? Come on, you've got just this breadth of experience right here on doing that. So what's the approach? How do you take it on? Long-winded question.
Let me take it from a Games Master's perspective first, perhaps.
Yeah.
I deal with a lot of brand new players, and I think this is something that you should do as a building block, particularly for new players ever. They don't know. So the blast situation is the first perfect example of the opportunity to present this to them as a concept as the Games Master. I blast. Well, let's talk about that. Let's describe what the blast looks like. And in a lot of my beginner games, they'll say, I'll do firebolt. Well, okay, fire. Well, how does that manifest from you? What is it about you? Is it a magic word? Is it you fire it from a gun? Is it a lucky card that you flick? You can trap a lot of this stuff together, but you just need to kind of be encouraging that right from the outset when players are first starting their journey, just to kind of let them imagine, because that's open to everyone for all the games, I guess. That's for storytellers, but for getting stuck into it as a player, Eric?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's not modes, what's the word I'm looking for. There's two kind of areas here that really much affect how players do this. And I think one is, whether the game master is how open they are to, utilize doing things to allow this to happen more than just, saying me just reflavoring how things work, right? And I think, James, you just talked about how you kind of will allow them to say even change a damage type, right? And so I think it's really important for game masters to maybe think about this and you have to tell the players, hey, I'm open to this. Because a lot of players just won't even know that they're even allowed to do this, right? Like there's just we're just so used to this is how things operate. So this is how the powers are supposed to be. So a lot of it relies on the game master, and a lot of it relies on the game. Like we've talked a lot about this. Like Savage Worlds, that's what the mechanics are built in. But when you have things like D&D and especially Pathfinder, where Pathfinder has 1 million powers that are so descriptive, it's a much harder thing to do. So how you start doing this as a player, I mean, first, a lot of this comes from your character, your backstory, right? And the initial kind of character creation and the flavor you're giving it at the very start of the game. If you're if you're the kind of person as a player who is like really likes making interesting characters and likes making long backstories, right? It's a much easier thing to do. If your game master is encouraging you to like, okay, well, let's talk about where your character's from. Like I think James, right? You'll get really communicative with players and be like, okay, yeah, this is cool. And then you bounce stuff back with them, right? You're like constantly bouncing ideas off with them, and you kind of will run with these interesting ideas. So a lot of that helps a lot. But yeah, I mean, I think the biggest struggle here that I've found, especially for games like D&D and Pathfinder and those type of games, is optimizing within your flavor. And I think that's what stops people the most. Because like I said at the very start, if somebody wants to be a lightning sorcerer or lightning wizard in D&D, it's extremely difficult because there's just not that many good offensive spells if they want to be a blaster especially. But like you think of lightning, right? Yeah. So that's what people just automatically go to is damage. They don't have like a lightning ball. I mean, there's a lightning ball, right? But there's a lot of other spells beyond that. It's all fire, right? Or it's even ice. So that's what stops a lot of people from doing it. I think part of it's on the game master to be like, hey, things can also, you can also have spells that have a theme of lightning that are not damage. Like you can have a spell like, I don't know, I'm kind of blanking on D&D spells right now, but some type of shield spell, right? Some type of defensive spell. And you're like, this is electromagnetic force that's actually causing this. So, if you're a player who doesn't have support from your game master and your game, it doesn't allow for this, then it is a big struggle. And I think you can still do it. And it's just mainly, it's a balancing act of taking some good spells and kind of really stretching the flavor out for them. This kind of works. And then going with kind of more niche spells that are really adjustable or really fit the flavor. And that's the balancing act for players. So on the Game Master side, I think here, Carl, that we've talked about a lot is borrow from Savage Worlds. I think if you're a D&D Game Master, if you're a Pathfinder Game Master, if you're a whatever blank Game Master, using things that Savage Worlds has, like synergy and mainly synergy, but also, like you said, James, like changing damage types, right? Changing little things about the powers to make them fit the theme. I think that will then, players will be like, oh, I can do this. I have the space to do this. And just going back to what synergy means, so synergy is a thing in Savage Worlds where, say, if going back to that lightning example, if you have a lightning power and the enemy that you're targeting is in water, they'll have some type of bonus because water conducts electricity. So it's just easier for them to do. And I think they have this somewhat in D&D where, and they have it in Pathfinder where if somebody's wearing metal armor, right, like Shocking Grasp, I believe, if they're wearing metal armor, they get a bonus, right, James, if I remember correctly?
Yeah.
And that's like synergy. And I think Game Masters should utilize that more, and that will allow players to do it.
And just to make sure, this goes hand in hand. I think we kind of glossed a little bit for those who don't know Savage Worlds, but let's say there's a power called Bolt, which is just your generic bolt of power, magic missile, so to speak.
Magic missile.
And you can flavor it, right? So it could be a lightning bolt. It could be a flame coming from your finger. It could be so. Synergies are, I've flavored this thing saying it's lightning, but that gives me a mechanical benefit or potentially a detriment, right? If you've got it flavored the opposite way. But it gives me a mechanical benefit for something that I've defined as making a stylistic or a flavor trappings choice. That's the key thing to synergies. So I just wanted to make sure that was clear for those who aren't playing Savage Worlds, who I don't know why they're not yet, but they should be. But if they haven't yet, so just explain it. But
well, I'm not. I'm still playing Dungeons and Dragons, so I'll put a D&D perspective on if I can.
Excellent.
Go for it.
I just want to put a little bit of a warning out here as well. If we're just changing the look and feel of a spell so that it suits the character more, and it's a descriptive change as opposed to a mechanical change, that's fine. Go crazy. I love it. There is a little bit of a word of caution about, as storytellers and games masters, changing around with mechanics of spells in any game system with a fear that it might actually overpower a spell or it might give it too much.
For sure, yeah.
Unexpected too much. Because often you won't know until these things hit the table. Some games are geared up. D&D is a good example where lots of creatures can resist fire. Very few creatures can resist other damage types like shadow or force or psychic. So there are a lot of fire spells because lots of monsters can resist it. So we just need to be a little bit careful when we're tweaking spells that you're not kind of completely changing the success of each spell. And for that, as a games master, I just do a trial period, just say, look, let's see how this works. If we're finding this is a bit too unbalanced, we'll just have to have a chat and kind of rein it back in again. Yeah. And so don't feel like you're kind of handing the keys over and saying, have at the, kind of come up with the craziest spells that you possibly can. And there are other reasons within certain game systems why some spells can't be used by certain types of characters and bits and pieces. So just be a little bit cautious on that. But once you've kind of got a grasp of things, and often this is about experience as well. Once you've got a bit of a grasp of things, understanding which levers you can pull on a spell to tweak it, whether that's duration or a casting time or a range, or adding a little bit of extra damage to something, or changing the damage type. How it looks and how it presents is entirely different, but I go for it. My only word of warning is make it ability to be changed if something's not working as intended.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's really good advice, and that's true. And you should never go too crazy with changing the mechanics. And that's why I like synergy, because it is, it's just kind of a free thing, right? It's not something you actually have to change about the base power. Another thing from Savage Worlds that I really like when you're talking about flavoring is what they call limitations, where you impose some type of limitation to make that power fit your theme better. and then it has a small bonus. In Savage Worlds, the bonus is usually it's a power point system. It's a magic point system. So it usually will cost 1 or 2 less. And if it's really, really cheap, it'll get like a +1 to your activation roll. Now you can utilize this when going back to what James was talking about. If you are tweaking stuff, sometimes to make it, to add a little bit of damage, you can then take away something else to make it fit that theme better.
Sure.
Right. And that also helps you balance. But going back to, you're a player in a game, and your game master's not allowing that, and the system itself is a very specific flavor. That is really the biggest trick. And I think people don't realize how much they can really change the flavor of a game. I mean, before we came on to recording this, I was talking about some examples, and one of them was, Fairy Fire, right? And in James's game, when I was the inventor, Fairy Fire.
I was more interested in your flamenco dancing bard.
Well,
actually,
we could go to that too. But like Fairy Fire, right? I don't know what the normal trappings in that, James. It's like some like fairy dust or something.
Yeah,
settles
fairy
and
dust
blinds,
sparkles on things
right?
and
Or
settles
fire.
on you and makes you glow. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. But then like we talk about, okay, if as my inventor had it as little bee drones that like exploded into glitter that just went everywhere and you couldn't get out. I had an ice mage who just kind of like crystallized water exploded and kind of snowflakes came down and was reflecting light. If you were at a fire mage, right, it's just easy to do kind of pyroclastic explosion or like a sunbeam, or there's just so many different ways, and you can get really crazy with it. But I think when we're talking about this, and that's good that you brought that up, James, is we're not just talking about magic powers. I think this even goes into the way classes present their special abilities. And one of the things I brought up was bards, right? We think of bards as always being the musical caster. They always have to sing. But it's like, no, I mean, I've had bards that use instruments and sing. I've had bards that spacing out for a second. I've had bards that use
the flamenco
like
dance.
Yeah, I've had a flamenco. I had a flamenco dancing bard who he did use castanets, but mainly it was his dancing, his vigorous dancing, and different dancing types that inspired people. And even he had intimidation feats, and I would do it like vigorously.
Your vigorous dancing inspired people,
and it frightened them and frightened monsters because they couldn't handle his vigorous hit movements. I have a little dragon familiar.
Let's just give that a month. We might need to revisit it.
Okay, settle on that.
If the vigorous hip movements are causing too much of a distraction. Sorry, I digress.
Yeah, he could have been. Maybe he should be canceled. I don't know. You can have your magic go be like a Pink Floyd light show of illusions. Different illusions exploding. That could be a bard thing. I had another bard that used ancient tales in an old draconic language that just kind of like words of power, right? That like altered the fabric of reality, and that's what kind of changed people's perspective on worlds. You could have it where like you whisper to ghosts. I mean, there's just so many ways to approach the way that we do this kind of performative art. It doesn't always have to be singing, and I think that's another kind of important take to what we're talking about here. Sorry, I'm going off a lot of tangents.
Great examples of how, but that gives you an idea of the concept, and then how you would then flavor spells to support all of that stuff as well. So no, that's a great example.
No, and
Sorry,
I think
Carl.
I was going to say I think more examples are great when you, especially for kind of the D&D players out there. I think we gave a couple of Savage Worlds examples when we were talking about synergies, but and then the Fairy Fire is a great example because I think sometimes people it takes a little bit to break your brain out of the fact that in D&D and Pathfinder, you do have these descriptions that tell you every nth degree of what this thing is doing and why it's doing it and how it manifests. And breaking your brain free of that is tough. So it's good that some of these examples, and I don't know if there's others you want to share, but I think it helps kind of, you just got to free your brain, I guess is the biggest one. It's like, what it can be, Eric, like even in the Savage Worlds, and we talked about how Savage Worlds likes this. It wasn't a fantasy game; it was more of a technology game, and your powers were manifested as a virtual playing field. For illusions. So you had this virtual playing field that would come out of your arm or something. I don't even remember exactly how it was.
Yeah, well, it was the illusionist arcane caster from Art of the Fantasy book, and then I flavored it into be because it was like old technology that it was basically a. We talked about this, I think, in the last episode, or like a holodeck, like kind of like a mini holodeck, and it was for a D&D, the version of the D&D game I called Mystics and Marauders. So it was like I could create like holograms of NPCs or holograms of making maps on the board. That was the whole flavor, and that was from a fantasy game to a science fiction game. So yeah, I really stretched the flavor with that one.
Yep, very cool.
It's interesting. There's one of the most famous campaigns in Dungeons and Dragons, which is Curse of Strahd, actually does this as part of the mechanics of the game. So, all spells have a decaying ability to them. It has kind of got this wispy, undead vibe to it. So mage hands should be considered kind of ghostly apparitions or skeletal hands. So, this is great to start to think about in terms of settings as well. And some of the most famous of the D&D games do that. Curse of Strahd's a great example. So that no spell can really be cast with good. So when they were creating food and drink, the food was a bit mouldy and a bit mildewy, and the drink was a little bit rancid to the taste, that kind of vibe. So you can expand it out beyond just a character as well.
That's a really good point, James. And I think that, because people love Curse of Strahd, and I hear about Curse of Strahd probably more than any, as far as D&D goes, probably more than any other kind of AP. And I think that probably has a lot to do with it because of how strong the flavor is in that game. And like you said, it's not even like, there's some mechanical stuff in there, but a lot of it is just flavor. And that really sticks with people, because it's not just your everyday normal fantasy adventure of like, okay, we've seen this spell a million times. We've seen this thing a million times. So yeah, that was a really good point to bring up.
So we talked a little bit about kind of the effects on the game, with synergies, with limitations, are there any other things that we should think about as we're flavoring, items or abilities or magic, that they have an impact on the game? I know there's obviously the role-playing interactions between players, something they've never seen before. I don't know, does that impact things like counterspell or anything along those lines? Again, I'm not a D&D guy, so I just hear a lot about those kinds of things. But is there any other things that we should be considering as far as the effects on the game and the mechanics thereof?
I've got about an hour in me to talk about counterspell if you want, Carl.
I've watched so many YouTube videos on counterspell, it's not even funny. And
one
I
of the
don't
best
even play
spells
D&D.
in the game.
Yeah.
Agreed. It's just, it's a tricky one to work through. The role-playing interactions are always a really big part of it, and how players and antagonists the flavouring of magic is perfect. I hate to say it, I ran Strixhaven last year, where each school had a very, very different flavour of magic, from spell choices to the way it looked and the way it was perceived. So the role-playing inter-party is also really, really impressive. Last year in my large D&D game, we played a warlock that changed the feeling of the spookiness of spells, and role-playing that effect on a very superstitious dwarf as I was always lots of fun. So there's lots of role-playing things that could be had here, by just subtly changing a flavour of a spell, for sure.
I think too, and this is something I just had the thought, and I've thought of this before, and I don't know if this is true. I haven't written a thesis, I've done a study on it, but at least in my experience, I have found, and maybe James, you can attest to this, Carl, you too, as game masters, when you do play a character that has a strong flavor and a different flavor, like you really invest yourself and you've changed things and you really are on theme, I feel like game masters will reward you more. They will give you like, okay, you've doubled down on this ice theme. You've taken your powers to fit this and the way it works. And so I'm going to give you this awesome ice staff.
I'm going to give you this fire sword.
I've thought about it. Like, you can inspire the game master and they will reward you. And I've seen this, again, I don't know if it's true, but maybe James, you can speak to that. Like, when you have a player who does that, doesn't that make you want to be like, oh, I want to create this cool item for them?
Of course.
Like, kind of that fits their theme, and it will, yeah. So I feel like that, like, as a player, one of the reasons you should do it is because you might get rewarded more from the game master. So,
well, I
think the story would hopefully work around it as well. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I think that's...
You want to do it. You want to buy into the theme. Sorry, Carl. Go.
No. I think you were hitting it on the head, so I'm sorry I jumped in. But I think game masters are players too. And so anything that makes things more fun for them, they're going to reward. So if being on theme and brand and just makes it so much more interesting, yeah, you're going to get rewarded just because it's fun for them as well to add a little tweak here and there. And, game masters are human too, right? So, the squeaky wheel, but the interesting player gets the grease in the sense. So, for sure.
Because it's like, oh, okay, the fighter who's just, okay, I'm just playing a vanilla fighter, which is nothing wrong with it, but okay, we're just going to give you the normal, like, +1 sword. Oh, this person who's, like, has this backstory and they've changed all their abilities. Maybe they've even, like, hurt myself by not taking the most optimized things. Oh, I'm going to, like, create an item for them that really fits their theme and, like, is built into their story because it's just so integrated, right? And that's what I was, like, mainly talking about.
And I do love when game masters reward suboptimal decisions if they are on theme and on brand and they add some interesting stuff. I like that. Because otherwise you are just optimizing play, which means picking spells that have the optimal trappings for the optimal use. And then sometimes theme isn't optimal, right? Playing with your theming and the way you do things. So, you're adding limitations. So hopefully Game Master, you recognize that and play to those strengths or play to those weaknesses without being too harsh because somebody was suboptimal in their decisions. And that goes beyond just flavoring. I mean, I make a lot of characters who, for the role play aspect, don't necessarily make the best decision or make decisions that are, glass cannon because that's exactly what they're supposed to be or whatever, So I interrupted you, James. Sorry about that.
No, I was done.
Oh, awesome!
You make some very good points.
Occasionally, I do pull that out. So
I guess there's one thing one more thing, I guess, in terms of how you would flavor. Don't forget, as storytellers, as games masters, we can do this too. This is some of the things that might make a really amazing, memorable villain, because spells aren't quite working as perceived, or they are fireball, but it's with gas and acid, that does damage as opposed to kind of, so we can do this as a storyteller as well. And a lot of what I do is try and find spells that would be similar, reskin them, kind of work through them. But I also introduce themes through the lower rungs of an organization as well. Like a cult's a great example. I will have lower acolytes of a cult doing a certain type of theme of spell that is suboptimal, but often you'll tweak some numbers and then we will build on that theme as you go through a layer or through an organization, so that you end up getting a kind of a nice theme of magic that runs through your entire dungeon or your entire kind of organization, if that makes sense. So using that theming stuff, always really, really cool.
And you reminded me now, James, of a trick I have kind of use, and that I've told people before, is either as a player or as a game master. Even if you're playing in fantasy, you're playing in whatever, if you kind of treat your character like they're a superhero or a supervillain, if you're a game master, that does help you bring flavor to the character more and change those trappings. Because, right, when you're making a superheroes, those are all about flavor. You know what I mean? There's not just like there kind of is the Superman, but there's, when you're going with like element or whatever, there's so much
Spider-Man.
there. So,
Spider-Man's a perfect example. It's like, I want everything to do with spiders.
Exactly.
Okay,
like 100%. So if when you're making, even if you're making, a sorcerer in D&D, if you kind of think of them as a superhero, and I pick a theme and that's like their superhero theme, then it does make it easier to kind of, inform your decisions and how you build them and the spells that you use. And with a game master, like you were talking about, like that's basically a supervillain, right? And that's their like underlings, and they all have their theme. And so that's the same way to look at it as a game master. Is like I'm making a supervillain now with their mooks and their underlings, right?
Maybe I've just exposed my bad 60s Batman kind of creation of organizations.
Hey, that's the most
I want
fun.
everything to do with penguins. Best. Everything to do with penguins and nothing else.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, everybody's got to have their thing, right? So we all have to have hobbies. So some are penguins, some are,
Strong narrative choices, strong flavor choices, while sometimes can become, corny or cheesy at times, it's always going to be the most memorable things for both for everybody, right? Those are the ones that are going to stick out with people, and larger than life characters are going to stick out. And that's not something you do with everybody, but I do think it's totally appropriate and will make it more fun. And those are what people remember. So yeah.
Yep. Excellent. So I don't know. Do you guys have any final thoughts or last bits of wisdom for those who are looking to flavor their characters or allow for flavoring?
I would say just start. Let's put a challenge out. Everyone look at your character sheets and reflavor one of your spells. You just start with something small and give it a go. You'll watch how it builds. How once you start to get a good vision about what you want it to look like. And for storytellers, just let it happen. Just watch it happen and improve your game.
And I really want to state that this is not even really all about Magic. I mean, I think Magic is the easiest way to go because it is so big and there's so many things they can do and all that stuff. But even the fighters out there, even the monks out there, even the ranges out there, you can really change the way. I mean, as long as there's like feats that you can take. The problem with something like D&D is that their classes, they're not a magic caster. There's not a lot of character decisions. I mean, there's not a player decisions to what the character does, right? You don't choose specific things that the fighter does unless you're like a battle master. But something like Pathfinder, you do choose all the feats. But even in D&D with the ranger or the fighter, you can still reflavor the way their techniques work, the way their kind of weapon is, the way they're, what they're actually doing, how they're accomplishing X ability, right? Can be reflavored. In what we're talking about and kind of have kind of the same effects.
Well,
so right, that sword and board fighter, right? That could just, I don't know. They were like, I had a character who was a chef, right, before, and they could just have a kitchen knives and a giant like a pot top or something, right? You can kind of change the way your equipment is, even things like that. So you can always have strong flavor choices, even if it's not Magic.
Well, in the old school gaming, where you didn't have classes and subclasses, what made a fighter difference was the flavoring. Oh, this is a swashbuckler, this is a this is a that. And it was all in the flavoring and not in the mechanics, though sometimes there were mechanical pieces of it, because there just wasn't so many classes and subclasses and prestige classes and all this kind of stuff to go along with it, that you needed to have to build a flavor. You just flavored. You just said, here's how this guy manifests himself. So, yeah, very cool. Very cool.
And it's important for flamenco bards to have maracas that do significant damage when you hit people with them.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, I think on that, all right. All right. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in. Hope you got something out of it. Remember to drop by masteringtherepg.com to learn all about us and our projects and contact support. We'd love to have your support. Please email gamemaster@masteringtherepg.com if you have a question, need some advice. You need something adjudicated. You got a difference of opinion. We'll tell you what our opinion is. So just write us in or tell us about some of the flavoring techniques you use. That would be great as well. We'd love to hear it. So once again, if you like the show, give us a positive review wherever you get your fine podcasts, wherever you get your fine I can't even say it. Anyway, wherever you get those.
Your font pinecasts.
Exactly. Well, I think that's a wrap. So once again, this is Carl with Eric and James. Say goodbye, guys.
It's Halloween.
Happy Halloween.
Goodbye, guys.
Spooky.